Welcome to the Writers Are People Too podcast, where you might just find that you shouldn't meet the writer of your heroes. Tonight we have with us David Agranoff. David, thank you for coming on tonight. Go ahead and give me a little bio on yourself.
I'm a science fiction and horror writer, critic, uh, aficionado, scholar, whatever you want to call it. I'm a long time super fan of Phillip K Dick, who I currently have just finished writing a nonfiction book about, but I'm also the author of 10 novels of my own. So,
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I did see that you hosted a podcast yourself, so glad to have another podcast host on here. It's the Dickheads podcast. So I went and I Googled Dickheads, and I was actually a little disappointed that I only found descriptions of myself. I didn't find your podcast. But then I typed in Dickheads podcast, and I did find you. So you said you're writing a nonfiction book about him. What's inspiring you to do that?
Well, so the idea with Phillip K Dick podcast. So the podcast is called Dickheads, and we did this basically because some friends and I were all big Phillip K Dick fans. And if you don't know who Phillip K Dick is, you probably know his work. Phillip K Dick was the author behind the novel that became Blade Runner and the stories that became Total Recall and Minority Report. And to me, he's one of the most important writers of the 20th century and one of the most prophetic. And he wrote over 40 novels in his lifetime. And so we had this idea that we wanted an excuse to read all of his novels and kind of make a project out of it. And so what we did was we started reading all of Phil's work in publication order, starting from his first novel in 1955, The Solar Lottery. And right now we're still covering his novels, but we're reading the ones that were published after his death. And so we're almost done. But going through all 44. So basically I became, in the beginning, if you listen to the podcast in order, you'll see I didn't know a ton about Phil. I thought I did. But now I'm kind of an expert, as you would be reading 40 odd some novels by a guy. But doing the research each episode and getting under the hood all the time of this guy's writing, it became like more of a thing. And what happened was when we were covering Phil's novel Deus Irae, which he co-wrote, and was released in the 70s, we knew that he co-wrote it with Roger Zelazny, a very famous science fiction author. And we knew that Phil had started the book and just not finished it. So I went to Cal State Fullerton, where his papers were, just to find out, how much of it he had written himself. And when I got there, I found all these unfinished fragments and outlines of things that he left behind before he died. And so my book is called Unfinished PKD because it's about 17 novels and outlines that he started and never finished. So some of it is like unreleased, unfinished works, including sequels, two attempts at sequels to Man in the High Castle, which is one of his most famous novels, of course, turned into an Amazon show. So the next book is called Unfinished PKD, and then one of the things I discovered in the process was that in the 60s, he wrote a letter to a friend outlining his whole formula for writing a novel. And it was mentioned in his biographies, but they hadn't been fully studied. And I basically murder boarded about 30 of his novels using the formula and have since become an expert in the Phillip K Dick formula.
Well, I mean, you got to tell me what the formula is then. Don't leave me hanging.
Well, it's interesting because my editor on Unfinished PKD kind of challenged me. He said, what good is it to study the formula if you don't use it? And so my most recent written novel and a forthcoming novel that I will have coming out in the future is one I use the Phillip K Dick formula to write. And that's called Great America in Dead World. And basically, I tried to picture myself. I tried to method act as Phil, and I tried to imagine 1963 Phil, because most of my favorite novels were written in the era between 1960 and 1966. And so I tried to imagine that Phil being transported to 2023 and writing about our modern world. And so this novel is a comment on climate change and MAGA and like online virtual realities and pocket universes, because those are the types of things Phil was interested in, and what is human, what is real. And so his formula basically is and God, why do I always end up talking about Phil instead of myself?
We'll get to you, don't worry.
Yeah, but Phil, what he did in the formula was he had this 5-page outline, and it starts off with how he introduces his world building character, which he calls the subhuman. And so if you notice in almost all of Phil's novels, they start off with a character who's so broke they can't afford to. In Ubik, he can't afford to open his door because he has to pay a nickel to open his door, and he doesn't have a nickel to pay for it. In Galactic Pot Healer, the character doesn't have the money to pay for an engineered dream with his dream circuit on his electronic smart bed, basically. And so if you look at all the novels, usually they open with an everyman, working schlub who can't afford something. And then the second character that's introduced is the protagonist, who's a person who's wealthy, who works for the government or a corporation, who is like kind of the antithesis of the first character. And then their stories eventually fuse, which he called the fuse point. And there's a personal problem, and then there's a world-sized problem. And so the personal problem will be like a divorce, and then the world-sized problem will be like an alien invasion or a computer virus, or in the case of the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, which is my favorite Philip K. Dick novel, it's a popular drug that basically the alien invaders use to get inside your mind, right? And so this personal and world-sized problems eventually fuse, and then that's where the novel comes together. So that's a short version of the Philip K. Dick formula. And you know, when I outlined Great America and Dead World, I was basically just I was like, okay, I got to hit this point, I got to hit that point, and I got to have this character. And I tried to think of characters in the way that Phil would. And it's funny, like the most, I made myself laugh at points because I was making decisions, story decisions that I would never make if I was writing a David Agranoff novel. But I was just trying to write, you know, in Phil's voice. And I know that's really cocky, and and there's nothing humble about it. But one of the examples that I keep using is that in this novel, there's characters who use an internet control, like a computer mouse that's inside your inner eye, because you have your internet controls inside your contact lenses. And I called this controller the Gang Lion, which is super Philip K. Dick, but it's not something I would write, but that's how he would name it. And I had this character using predictive text to have a conversation. And I had another character say, "Don't use your conveyed." And I started laughing because Phil loved to hyphenate two things to name technology, like the con apps for the apartments, the condominium apartments, and the homeopapes, and these types of things. And so when I wrote the word conveyed, that's not something I would name in a book, but that's something Phil would name it. And I just started laughing because I was like, oh my God, I'm doing it. I'm attempting
You're
to
becoming
channel
him.
this guy. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting
So
because sometimes we always emulate who we, what do they say? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery or something like that. It's like we always
right.
try and emulate our favorite authors. And I mean, there are favorites for a reason. Like you like him perhaps for his themes and his world
Yeah.
building and stuff, but I'm sure you like his writing style as well. So of course you want to emulate that a little bit.
Yeah, I've never wanted to emulate him this close. And it's funny because a lot of people write in Lovecraftian pastiche, right? There's a lot of authors who choose to write Lovecraftian fiction and they try to sound like Lovecraft and have that kind of gothic feel and whatever. I've never tried to write in another author's voice before. Or never tried to write as somebody other than me. And it was a very strange feeling for me. And I had fun doing it. I would probably won't ever do it again. But part of the whole thing in studying the formula was just trying to get into the idea of like, well, if I'm going to study it, if I'm going to teach it, if I'm going to teach people what the Philip K Dick formula is, I have to experiment with using it. And
Mm,
yeah, it was fun. It was a cool
yeah.
thing. I've always been influenced by Phil in terms of themes and concepts. So many of my pitches for my books have been, it's like PKD meets this. And so I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I've done that forever. My novel Goddamn Killing Machines was, it's like PKD wrote The Dirty Dozen, right? And
All right. Well, we got a fanboy here. He's even wearing a PKD shirt, I guess.
yeah. And so I've always been, I wouldn't have done the podcast if I wasn't already influenced by his work. And the
Yeah.
things that I think are fascinating or interesting about Philip K. Dick is, and what's funny is he's not even necessarily my favorite science fiction writer, but I think he is one of the most important voices of the 20th century. And that's why I think he's important to study and research. And he's fascinating. He had a fascinating life. If I was, push comes to shove, John Shirley, who is a good friend of mine, is my favorite living writer. And if anything, my brain kind of connects more with John Brunner, who's kind of like a British science fiction writer of the 60s and 70s, and is one of my favorites. And probably politically, I'm a little bit more connected to, say, an Ursula Le Guin. Her politics kind of match mine more. But Phil takes up this special place because for one thing, I think he's one of the, like I said, I think he's one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And you can't, I mean, a masterpiece like Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which gets underrated for how brilliant it is because it has a good movie based on it in Blade
Mm-hmm.
Runner. But Blade Runner, as good as it is doesn't touch the philosophical bona fides of the novel, which is like 1,000 times more brilliant than the movie, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah, I've never read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, nor have I read the short stories that Minority Report are based off of. But I've watched both the movies, and they were great movies. But what one term that you had said earlier is you said that he was prophetic in a lot of ways.
yeah.
We'll move on from PK Dick here in a minute, but my final question about him is: in what ways did you see him being prophetic in these stories?
Well, I did a video recently where I said 10 weird technologies that Philip K. Dick predicted. And he predicted Chat GPT in the Simulacra in 1963. He predicted app dating, but he saw it going through, like, you look up numbers in a phone book and call people because he was doing it in the 60s. There's all kinds of different things, but I think one of the things that you will see if you start reading, so a Philip K. Dick movie like you're talking about, Hollywood has translated a little bit of the paranoia that Phil wrote about and turned them into Hollywood chases. You know, like Minority Report has a lot of running, and Paycheck has a lot of running, and people on the run in paranoid situations. But what Phil was doing in his fiction, and to take an example of comparing the movie of Blade Runner to the novel of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is that there are multiple philosophical issues besides not just what is human, what is ethics, what does it mean to have empathy, to what does it mean to care for animals, what does it mean, what value do animals hold in a world that is dying, and all these things that Blade Runner doesn't even mention. You just have androids, like an android revolution, basically.
Yeah.
And now that being said, Blade Runner does touch on the empathy and those things in a really small way, in a blink and you'll miss it kind of way, whereas the novel goes into it very deeply. And for example, in the movie, you'll have an owl on a shelf, and those of us who've read the book know, oh, that's probably a mechanical or a robotic owl. But if you don't read the novel, you wouldn't know the symbolism of that, and you wouldn't know those things, because in the novel, the issue of electronic or fake animals as like a status symbol are a huge part of that novel that is not even touched on in the movie, right? And so Phil does all kinds of those interesting and philosophical things with his novels. And for example, my favorite, the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, there's a way you can read it where you could just be like, man, this book is about a really bad acid trip. But there's a lot more going on. There's all kinds of postmodern, philosophical ideas that are being introduced in that book that you might not get to the second or third time you read it, and you should read it 2 or 3 times. But yeah, so obviously, yes, I'm a huge Philip K. Dick fan. I wouldn't have done, 100 episodes of the podcast if I didn't think he wasn't worth talking about. So
yeah, absolutely.
And I know a lot of people have come here just to see what I'll say about Phil. Our fans of the podcast, what bonus stuff will he say? So
I'm pretty sure they've heard you say everything already. So
what's funny is I haven't talked much about the formula on the podcast because I've been saving that mostly for the book. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll clip it and you can share that to your channel.
Well, it's funny. I recently taught the formula in an online class with a whole slideshow and everything. And that was really my kind of coming out with the formula. And I will be teaching that formula at the Phillip K Dick Festival in Colorado this summer in Fort Morgan, Colorado, June 13th through the 16th. And we'll be doing a huge preview of the unfinished works, and there are Dick scholars coming from all over the world for that. So if you're a big Philip K Dick person and you get to Colorado, you know how Quaid in Total Recall said, get your ass to Mars, get your ass to Colorado if you're a Philip K Dick fan.
Nice. Awesome. All right, well, let's talk about you for the first time in this podcast.
Yeah.
Your book, People's Park. That was actually published yesterday, right? I was on Amazon. It looked like it was published yesterday.
Yeah, technically it was released yesterday. I've had a copy for a couple weeks, but yeah, People's Park is it's a labor of love. It's my 10th novel, and it's it kind of combines a lot of the things that I love: punk rock, horror, bizarro, science fiction. And I kind of see it as a bridge book between the punk rock horror fiction that I've been writing and science fiction, which is the direction I want to go more in the future with my writing career, is more towards the science fiction than the horror stuff. I'll never stop writing horror. I love horror. But my focus ideally would be more towards the science fiction, including the book that we talked about earlier, The Great America and Dead World.
Yeah, I do have a question about the science fiction a little bit later on, but let's
Yeah.
read this tag here. So you said it is a love letter to freaks and weirdos everywhere. A true 80s coming of age bizarro horror novel that reads like Stranger Things with punk rock, skateboards, and a dose of mind-bending sci-fi. So, without me directly asking your age, I'm just going to assume that you came of age in the 80s. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, I came of age around the same time as Justin, the main character in the book. There's a lot of similarities between his coming of age and my coming of age. Um, so I got into punk rock when I was between the summer between 8th grade and freshman year of high school, which was 1989 for me. The same summer, and a lot of the same discoveries. The main character of this book, Justin, is discovering punk rock and alternative culture in that same summer and at the same age. He also had a parent who died. My mother died. His father died. So yes, there's a lot of autobiographical similarities. But
Mm-hmm.
and I should say that one of the reasons why I think it's such a fertile ground to write about alternative culture in that era is because punk rock and hardcore and, you know, kind of freak and weirdo culture was very different before there was a, you know, kind of one thing that really changed the landscape and made those things a little bit more mainstream, and that was Smells Like Teen Spirit. You know, when Nirvana became like basically the number one song in the country and a big hit, everything changed because after, you know, before Nirvana, it wasn't the case. But after Nirvana, it was okay to have a mohawk at school. It was okay to be a punk rocker at school. But let me tell you, it was very different before that because the jocks hated us, the rednecks hated us, and growing up a punk rocker in a small college town in the Midwest, Bloomington, Indiana, you know, we were hated and we were constantly getting picked on for having a skateboard. You know, trucks would drive by and they'd yell "skate or die," and the next thing you know, you have like 8 guys just beating you up because it was funny to them. And so we were constantly in fights. And for us in my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana, you know, because now kids hang out on the internet, they like socialize through the internet. But when I was a kid, if we wanted to hang out with the people that were like-minded to us, we had to find a gathering space. And for us, it was People's Park. And I know because I traveled to punk rock scenes in other cities. For example, Chicago had a place they called Punkin' Donuts. It was a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot they all hung out in. And coincidentally, I actually wrote a novel that, much like People's Park, takes place a lot at Punkin' Donuts a couple years ago called Boot Boys of the Wolf Reich. And I know in Indianapolis, they had the parking lot next to a florist, which was, but they all skated in that parking lot. And that was their hangout, their sanctuary. And when I kind of came up with this novel, I was listening to an interview with somebody who was about my age, who was on some podcast, and she was talking about where she grew up in New Mexico, and I believe it was Santa Fe, and how they had this parking lot where all the skateboarders gathered. And I realized that this was a real phenomenon, this pre-internet, like, hangout sanctuary thing. And then I got really passionate about wanting to write a novel about that place for me. But what's really fascinating is because People's Park in Bloomington has a really fascinating backstory and history that I didn't know about when I was hanging out there. And if you read this novel, you might think I made it up, but it's real. And because People's Park is a weird thing in Bloomington because it's right in the middle of the downtown strip. And so there's businesses on each side of the street like on this strip that goes between the university and the central square of the town. And right in the middle, there's this park where ideally there should be shops there. And that's because in 1969 there was a shop there. And at the time it was this business called the Black Market. And it was this black owned business in Bloomington, Indiana that was run by black students from the university, activist students. And it was like the only Afrocentric store pretty much in southern Indiana, because an hour north in Indianapolis is a very black city, very, very African American city, but Bloomington only basically had the students at the time. And because Indiana in 1969, not surprisingly racist. And the Klan ended up driving down from a nearby town called Martinsville, and they firebombed the black market. And on December 26, 1969. And burned it down, burned it to the ground. And so how People's Park happened is a lot of the activists at the time took over the space and said, we want to turn this into a park that can be like a positive light out of this tragedy, out of this awful thing. 20 years later, all the punks and weirdos like me who just grew up there are hanging out in this park. And we never knew about that. We never knew the history. At least I didn't. And I found out about it when I read this book about activism in the Midwest called Descent in the Heartland, which was this academic book, this history book. And I read this story. So combine that knowledge with this wanting to write about this place. And I had wanted to write a novel about Bloomington, and I had made an earlier attempt, maybe 10 years earlier, to write a different concept for a science fiction novel about my hometown, and it didn't work. But once I started thinking about, I had this idea in my head that what if when they bombed the park or bombed the store, that they unleashed this kind of like evil force, that so like this spot was just pumping out hatred. And I had this idea that the sonic energy or the sound, the buzzing that is caused in the ears from live punk rock inoculated these kids and these people that were hanging out at the park. And so all this hateful energy is coming out, and it's affecting, it's making these jocks and rednecks that, and by the way, part of the whole mix of this is that the jock and redneck kids used to cruise up and down the street that People's Park was on. So as you can imagine, them cruising up and down the street and the weirdos hanging out in this one spot, we were constantly getting in fights. And so that whole like mix is part of the whole aura of the story.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that really kind of pulled it all together, like the rug and the dudes, you know, in the Big Lebowski that ties the room together, for me was there was this one of the people that was a staple in People's Park, like this guy that always hung out in People's Park, was this guy named Fred. And he used to listen to static on his headphones all the time, and he would constantly be writing in notebooks. And he, you know, would talk to himself sometimes, and sometimes he'd talk to those voices that he was hearing in the static. And everyone called him Electric Fred. And he was a regular he had a tab at the Jiffy Treat ice cream store that was down the street, and he had a tab at the Runcible Spoon, which was the oldest coffee shop in Bloomington, still there. And one of the things that ended up happening is that my wife, before I knew her, worked at the Spoon, and Fred was a regular for her. She constantly had him as a customer, and he'd buy a cheese sandwich and a Coke at the Spoon all the time. And she talked to him quite often. And one day I was talking about how I wanted Fred to be a character in this book. and be kind of a hero in this book. And I didn't know how that was going to be, but I just wanted Fred to be a hero in the book. And she dropped this bomb on me and she was like, I have 2 of his notebooks. Because Fred gave her as a gift one day at the coffee shop 2 of his notebooks. And
Wow.
I lost my mind and started reading the notebooks. And there was all this amazing stuff about ropes that he could travel to Mars, using these magic ropes, and like there was a drawer that he could communicate with the Prime Minister of China. I mean, China doesn't have a prime minister, but whatever. And all this amazing stuff in his notebook. And that's really, reading that notebook really kind of pulled the concept together. And Fred became like this major and important character in People's Park and the novel, as he was the actual park in the 80s. And Fred, the real life Fred, died a couple years ago. And a lot of the punk rockers in Bloomington stayed in touch with Fred. And in fact, a friend of mine actually became one of his caretakers and one of the people that actually like helped Fred. And there was a really great memorial online for Fred when he passed. And I was able to actually communicate on Facebook with Fred's sister and kind of got like an okay to fictionalize, because the Fred in my book is a little bit fictionalized. He's not exactly Electric Fred. I mean, his backstory is different. For one thing, the Fred in my novel witnessed the bombing of People's Park, and that is, of course, a fictionalization. The real life Fred did not see that. And according to, his stories, his actual story of how he became Electric Fred is actually a little bit kind of nastier than the fictionalized version. Because now I don't know if it's true or not, but according to him, and this is something that was well known and something that he talked about, that he was a part of the MK Ultra experiments in the 60s. According to his notebooks and according to what he would tell people. Now, do
you think he's a reliable witness?
Now, I just asked my wife that same question the other day, and I don't know. He was pretty coherent about it. So when he would talk about it, and what was he? I don't know. But the Electric Fred in my story kind of had a break with reality after witnessing this horrendous crime on December 26, 1969. So it's a little different from the reality, but and I don't want to. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I've seen a couple times this theme of weirdos or misfits popping up, and I think actually in the beginning of your book you dedicated People's Park to, you said, all the freaks and weirdos that you've ever hung out with, present company not excluded, I hope. And so I would say that not fitting in rather, is part of like a part of any coming of age story. But what really inspires you to be the speaker for the misfits?
Well, I'm one of them. I'm a weirdo. I don't consider myself a normie. I've been vegan for 30 years, which makes me, different. I've been straight edge since 1989. And believe me, not drinking or eating animal products makes me, somewhat different. I'm a sci-fi guy. I when people are, I am into sports, so that's probably the most normal thing about me. I definitely, am a hoop head. I'm a big basketball guy. I am from Indiana after all. But I just, I've been a punk rocker since I was young. And I think even earlier than that, and one thing that you'll see a theme in there, being a horror weirdo is kind of part of this too, because a lot of the punk rockers in Indiana got their start with our horror host, Sammy Terry, who's mentioned in the novel, who used to host horror movies on Friday nights in Indiana. And a lot of us who became kind of different people, and kind of separated from the mainstream, like we first kind of got open to being strange because we stayed up on Friday nights watching horror movies with this guy talking to a spider on a string. And so he's referenced in this book, and um, I think he's important. And but I think I being a punk rocker, because of the fights that we got into, because of doing it before, because I do think the importance of before Nirvana and after Nirvana is really important, because we were fighting for our lives. And I saw a quote, and I quoted this at the beginning of my novel, Punk Rock Ghost Story, from the singer of Bad Religion, who said, everyone talks about the early 80s like this glorious old school, glory days, but we were fighting for our lives,
Hmm.
and it wasn't
I literally actually wrote that as a question for you, because I used to skate, and as you just mentioned, you're like, hey, we were fighting all these people off, and do you think that the 80s is idealized looking back on it? Like, what was it like growing up in the 80s as opposed to what it might be like now?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. I mean, because we idealize it. Yes, I mean, I think hardcore was better then, and punk rock and skateboarding was cooler then, because we were, a little bit less mainstream, and it was a little bit cooler, in quotation marks. Um, but at the same time, like, if I had children, which I don't, I'd rather them grow up in a time where it was safe to do those things. And maybe it would be, I don't know. But I think the fact that we had to kind of fight for our lives back then made us stronger, tougher people who,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I see young people like whining about the most petty little things, and I'm just like, oh my god, we were fighting for our freaking lives back then, and so I guess I kind of, and I don't want to kind of make it sound like, we were in trench warfare or something. I'm not saying that, but it was definitely a little bit harder of a time. And for example, I play basketball a couple times a week and pickup games out here, and sometimes people are surprised, like, how like strong I can play down low, fighting in the trenches, and like, if there's a loose ball and we're fighting for it, and it's just like, dude, you have no idea how much I've been through,
Play
you
street
know.
ball.
Yeah, so street ball is nothing, but in some ways, I kind of, I don't go to hardcore shows like I used to. So in some ways, it's kind of replaced the physicality of the mosh pit for me, is playing basketball, you know. And this last Monday night, I played in a basketball run that on Tuesday, my coworker who plays with me in basketball, we were both all beat up on Tuesday, talking about how our wrists were sore and we were all bruised and everything. And I was like, but I kind of like that. I like physical, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in
Awesome.
that. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, my final question for you, and you touched on this a little bit, when you said that there was like a dark energy coming from the store that was burned down. But how does sci-fi play a role in your story?
In this one, yeah.
Yeah.
There is, some of that's a bit of a spoiler, but there is definitely some alternate realities going on, and you know, some twists in this book that get really weird and kind of out there. And I'm really proud of how weird this book is. If you like weird, I think my short story collection, Amazing Punk Stories, which is all punk rock themed pulp fiction, has some really weird stuff in it. But as far as my novels go, this final act in People's Park gets pretty bananas. And it starts off pretty normal. And my last book before this, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, is just vampires killing Nazis in World War II. So it doesn't, which I will say that one. I wanted people with The Last Night to Kill Nazis to think it was just going to be fun Nazi killing stuff. And I think there's a much deeper theme of Holocaust revenge and psychic trauma that I hope will surprise people when they read The Last Night to Kill Nazis, that it's a deeper book than maybe it might seem from the title. And the same thing kind of goes with People's Park. I'm always trying to fit deeper and more message type themes into these things. But some are more political than others, but yeah. And if you like the mind-bending sci-fi stuff too, I would want to put a shout out for my longtime co-host at Dickheads, Anthony Trevino, and I wrote a novel a year or two ago together called Nightmare City that is available out there. And Nightmare City, we pitched it as The Wire, the HBO show, The Wire, if Phillip K. Dick and Clive Barker were on the writing staff. And so that one is very sci-fi, and it's very much a kind of 10 minutes in the future type of thing, but also, kind of our take on X-Files type story. We would like to eventually write many books where we can do some monster of the week, some mythology with Nightmare City. And so I would want to put a shout out to Nightmare City out there as well, because if people are looking for the sci-fi, I think that's one of the better sci-fi works that I have out there. And then I do have a science fiction novel called Goddamn Killing Machines, which is set in the 24th century. It's the most it's kind of military sci-fi with a title like Goddamn Killing Machines. You'd expect that. And and that one is definitely in the theme of the what is human and what does it mean to be human. So I would put that one out there as one to explore too. And that's from the same publisher as The Last Night to Kill Nazis, Clash Books. And those are both thematically they're both structured in a similar way. They're action adventure stories. And the idea with both of them was to pay tribute to World War II men on a mission movies like Guns of Navarone, The Dirty Dozen, Where Eagles Dare, because I absolutely love those mission movies. And I really want with both those novels, I wanted to, kind of spin that coin a little bit.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for coming on tonight, everybody. We had David Agranoff.
Yeah, thank you.
Did I say your name right?
Okay. You said it right the first time, Agranoff.
Oh.
So you said it right the first time, which is more important anyways. But yeah. And and folks want to find me out there. I'm on I'm still going to call it Twitter at D Agranoff author. You can find me on Facebook. I'm pretty easy to find, but definitely check out the Dickheads podcast. My personal podcast is called Postcards from a Dying World, and I basically do whatever I want on that one. And so I've had plenty of author interviews, that kind of thing. And we are also doing a whole mini series on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame short stories and on postcards. And so I hope people find that. But most importantly right now is People's Park. I this is the new baby out in the world, so I really hope people find it, enjoy it. And this is an indie book, so please help me out. If you like it, enjoy it, please review it and spread the word, because word of mouth is everything for a book like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody find him on Instagram, Find him on YouTube. Find him on X, Twitter, like you just said. Find him on Amazon and like all his stuff.
Yeah, and Matt, thank you for such really good questions. I really appreciate a chance to talk about something besides Phillip K. Dick.
Well, we still spent half the time doing that, so I'm sure you got some pleasure
I'm
out
still
of
gonna
it.
talk about Phil. I can't not. And
Awesome.
but he is really awesome and important. So I can't can't not talk about him.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for coming on. Bye.